$90 million, one courtroom, and a woman on the verge of tears. When J.D. Vance filed a lawsuit against Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in front of live cameras and a stunned nation, it wasn't just a legal battle, it was a reckoning. The kind of moment where reputations shatter, masks fall, and silence becomes louder than words. Inside that federal courtroom, every glare, every hesitation, every word spoken into the mic wasn't just for the record. It was for all of us watching. Was this about justice or something more calculated? Was it law or theater disguised as truth? What you're about to witness isn't pulled from court transcripts. It's a dramatized reflection, shaped from headlines, whispers, and the raw tension we all feel when truth is on trial. The characters are public, the emotions are real, but the story, it's imagined, not to deceive, but to illuminate. Because in a world where facts clash with feelings, sometimes a fictional story can speak more honestly than a press release ever could. Now, let's open the door to what really happened that day. It was just past 12:07 a.m. in Washington, D.C., but the halls of the Capitol still throbbed with fluorescent defiance. AOC stood alone at the edge of room 228, the echo of her heels fading behind as the hearing adjourned. Another night, another stone wall. The GOP committee members had walked out 20 minutes before the vote. Again, her hands trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, but from fury. She wasn't new to resistance, but tonight something had fractured deeper. J.D. Vance had sat across from her all evening with that half smile. The kind of smirk that isn't offered in conversation, but carved like a signature. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't needed to. Every time she brought up veterans' health care reform or the environmental bill stalled in committee, he just redirected the room with a smooth, practiced deflection, a manufactured calm. A polished puppet with no soul, she'd muttered under her breath as the room emptied. And somehow it stuck. It clung to her thoughts like static. 15 minutes later, still in her navy blue blazer and undone top button, she opened her phone and tapped live. She didn't plan to say anything. She told herself it would be 5 minutes, just to check in with her followers. But something shifted as soon as she saw the flood of hearts and comments begin to rise on the screen. Over 23,000 people were watching before she even spoke. She sat by the window. Behind her, the faint outline of the Capitol dome pulsed in the glass. One side of her face lit by the desk lamp, the other melting into shadows. AOC exhaled slowly. "I'm not supposed to say this," she began. Her voice was low, almost hesitant. "I'm supposed to go home, say nothing, be strategic. But I'm done pretending that what's happening in that room is anything close to public service." She paused. The chat exploded. She leaned closer. Her eyes gleamed, not with tears, but with a kind of unfiltered resolve. J.D. Vance sat there tonight like he was hosting a podcast, not answering to the American people. He gives these rehearsed answers, designed to say nothing, please everyone, and move the needle for no one. You know what that is? That's not leadership. That's cowardice, wrapped in charm, delivered in a Harvard accent. The moment felt private, even as 80,000 viewers joined within 3 minutes. There was no script, no PR handler, just her anger, and a generation tuning in while lying in bed, earbuds in, too wired to sleep. "And I'll say it," she added, voice rising. J.D. Vance is a polished puppet with no soul. And the fact that so many people in that chamber nod and smile as he speaks, that should terrify you. The screen shuddered slightly as she shifted. A gust of wind outside rattled the window. You ever feel like the system was designed to keep the angriest, most desperate parts of America entertained, while the rest of us keep bleeding in silence? She looked into the camera, dead on. Well, I'm not going to be silent. It lasted 7 minutes. But by sunrise, it had already been clipped, stitched, captioned, and shared over 9 million times. News outlets debated whether it was a meltdown or a moment of bravery. J.D. Vance's team issued a one-line response. Senator Vance is focused on real work, not late-night outbursts. But those watching knew something had shifted. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it, and how real it felt. Because for the first time in a long time, people weren't just watching politics. They were watching a reckoning begin. By the time dawn stretched its pale arms across the Capitol skyline, the clip of AOC's midnight broadcast had already begun to reshape the morning's narrative. On MSNBC, the Chiron blazed, "AOC finally says what we all think." Over on CNN, no more filters, Ocasio-Cortez unleashed. And even some conservative outlets couldn't ignore the wildfire. Raw, reckless, real, wrote a surprising opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal. The internet had chosen its battlefield before most staffers even poured their first cup of coffee. But one place stayed quiet, eerily so. No statement, no tweet, no clarification or denial. J.D. Vance's office remained completely, deliberately silent. At first, political analysts speculated it was strategic restraint. Let the storm burn out. Let AOC look emotional. Let the headlines do the work. But those closer to Vance knew better. When J.D. Vance goes quiet, he's not avoiding the fight. He's loading the first blow. Back in Ohio, hundreds of miles away from the buzz of D.C., Vance sat alone in his office, a room flanked by mahogany bookshelves in the steely gray of a Midwest morning. The shades were half-drawn, cutting the room in diagonal shadows. On his desk, a tumbler of untouched coffee had long gone cold. The screen in front of him showed AOC's face frozen mid-sentence, eyes fiery, lips mid-phrase. He hit replay, again, and again, and again. Each time he listened, not just to what she said, but to how it was landing with the public. The power of the moment wasn't in the insult. It was in how damn true people believed it sounded. A polished puppet with no soul. The phrase rang in his head like a hammer striking a cracked bell. He'd been called worse in private, certainly, but never like this. Never in a viral moment that threatened to redefine him in the eyes of the country. He leaned back in the leather chair. For a moment, silence. Then a bitter laugh. "That's what they want?" he muttered. "A martyr with good lighting?" He stood, crossed the room slowly, and poured the cold coffee into the sink. Through the window, the wide skies of Ohio looked deceptively calm, like a lake before a storm surge. But inside, his mind raced. He wasn't going to tweet back. He wasn't going to rant on cable. That wasn't his style. No, J.D. Vance played the long game. He knew how the media cycle worked. A soundbite today was old news tomorrow, unless you turned it into an avalanche. He walked back to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a manila folder with 2 words penciled in sharp ink: defamation strategy. He had drafted it months ago, not for AOC specifically, but for anyone who crossed a line and underestimated him. People saw the Yale degree, the best-selling memoir, the clean-cut look. They forgot the years in courtrooms, the quiet obsession with building cases like puzzles, waiting for the final piece. He opened his laptop again, pulled up the federal court database, and began typing. Not a tweet, a motion, not a clapback, a lawsuit. This wasn't going to be about headlines. This was going to be about leverage, about narrative, about how far she was willing to go and how much it would cost her. He closed the laptop softly, not slamming it, just letting the lid click with precision. Then he looked up at the ceiling, calm, methodical, almost surgical. "So it's war," he whispered, and for the first time in months he smiled. By the time the East Coast had fully woken up, J.D. Vance was already 2 hours into quiet coordination. He hadn't stormed into a press conference. He hadn't issued a fiery statement. There was no angry tweet, no outraged video, no finger-pointing circus, just silence, and the low murmur of deliberate power assembling itself. His Ohio office, still curtained against the pale morning, now buzzed with the soft clicks of keyboards and murmured voices over encrypted phone lines. 2 aides, a former federal litigator and a media crisis consultant, had been summoned without explanation. They didn't need one. The air was electric with quiet preparation. Vance stood at the center of it all, calm, buttoned, unreadable. "Before we draft a word," he said evenly, "I want you to ask yourselves something." The room stilled. He paced once, hands clasped behind his back like a professor before delivering a lecture that would change someone's future. "How much truth," he asked slowly, "are they ready for?" The aides glanced at each other. One opened a notebook hesitantly, unsure whether it was a rhetorical question. I don't mean political truths, he clarified, turning. I mean the kind that bleeds. There was no fire in his voice, just cold clarity, and that made it worse. Rage could be dismissed. This had intention. It was the kind of thinking that rearranged people's careers, reputations, even lives. One misplaced truth in the wrong hands, released at the right moment, could undo an empire or build one. The media consultant leaned in. You're talking narrative payload. Are you going to counter her moment? Vance didn't blink. No, I'm going to redefine it. Another pause. The litigator, older, with salt in his beard and a memory of 5 Senate hearings under his belt, leaned forward. What's the angle? The truth they never saw coming, Vance replied, and one she won't be able to outrun. He turned away, letting the words settle like ash after a fire. At the far end of the room stood a tall oak cabinet, secured with a simple brass lock. He walked toward it, steady and slow, while the others fell silent behind him. The key was already in his pocket. It had been for weeks. He slid it in, turned it with a metallic click, and pulled the drawer open. Inside, beneath carefully arranged documents and sealed envelopes, was a manila folder thick with age and weight. Across the front, written in unassuming black marker, were 3 words: Project Shadow Tape. He lifted it out slowly, setting it on the desk like a loaded weapon no one had expected him to carry. This, he said quietly, isn't a reaction. It's a decision. And with that, the meeting began. The folder sat unopened on the mahogany desk for nearly 20 minutes. J.D. Vance didn't rush. He simply sat, eyes unfocused, letting the silence do its work. Behind the closed door, the team waited, each person glued to their role, guessing the next move. But Vance wasn't interested in immediate theatrics. His war would be quieter and far more dangerous. He pulled the folder toward him slowly, not to skim through it, but to reflect on the strategy itself. Not the contents, those he already knew, but the reason. The why had to be deeper than pride. He had been attacked before. Political campaigns, hit pieces, college clips taken out of context. They'd called him an opportunist, a hypocrite, a man with no clear spine. And yet he'd survived, not because he was invincible, but because he had learned. Each wound had taught him where people struck hardest, and which blows actually stuck. He opened a drawer, removed a small stack of old op-eds and headlines. J.D. Vance, the betrayer of Appalachia, from hillbilly to hill hypocrite. The empty suit behind the books. The paper had yellowed. He had kept them all. For a man like him, reputation didn't hinge on charisma or social media charm. It rested on whether he stood for something. And right now, as the entire nation played AOC's midnight clip like it was a new national anthem, he knew one thing. Fighting back couldn't be about him, not his name, not his career. It had to be about something people had almost given up on. He circled 2 words on a notepad beside him. Defend decency. That would be the frame. No counterattack, no tantrums, no defensiveness. Just calm resolve. Dignity in the face of provocation, but beneath that, precision. Because while the headlines focused on his silence, his strategy was already moving. He picked up the phone. I want a team of 3, he told the chief of staff. Not to dig into her votes, that's been done. I want her media strategy, her arcs, her hashtags, her rhythms, who she appeals to and why. I want her influence mapped like a battlefield. There was a pause on the line. You're not going after her record? No, Vance said, flat. Records are dry. People vote with emotion. I want to know the story she's telling America, and where I can cut it off at the root. The language was surgical, not angry, not reactive. He didn't want to destroy her. He wanted to disarm her, quietly, cleanly, and if necessary, permanently. From a shelf behind his desk, he pulled a thin book, Rules for Radicals. AOC had once quoted it on a podcast. Make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. He smiled faintly. We'll see. His legal team would handle the formal lawsuit, paperwork, timelines, and procedural smoke. But that wasn't the real war. The real war was narrative. She had fired first in front of millions. He wouldn't fire back. He would frame back. By noon, two research analysts from D.C. had boarded flights to New York. One was a former Twitter trust and safety executive. The other had built opposition profiles on 6 sitting senators. Neither knew each other. Neither knew exactly what they were walking into, but both had one instruction: study how she moves, then show me where she bleeds. Outside the office windows, Ohio was gray and quiet, unaware of what had just been set into motion. Inside, Vance stood slowly, gazing at the closed folder once more. He wouldn't speak, not yet, but when he did, it wouldn't be noise. It would be the line no one saw coming. The email hit the federal clerk's inbox at 8:47 a.m. sharp. Attached were 42 pages of legal firepower and a single claim bolded at the top: deliberate and malicious character assassination with intent to mislead the public. J.D. Vance had filed a defamation lawsuit against Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The figure, $90 million. The intention, unmistakable. By 9:12 a.m., Politico was the first to break it. By 9:18, CNN was live. By 9:24, the headlines began to splinter like glass under pressure. J.D. Vance sues AOC, silencing or self-defense. The cable news split into its predictable battle lines. Fox called it accountability. MSNBC called it a political stunt. Twitter didn't bother with nuance. It exploded. Instantly, hashtags began trending. Hashtag Vance vs AOC. Hashtag 90 million muzzle. Hashtag truth on trial. Some were satirical. Most were angry. A few just said, finally. Back in Ohio, Vance said nothing. No press conference. No camera-ready rebuttal. Just a legal filing that read like a slow, methodical dissection of character warfare. His team had spent 4 nights perfecting every phrase, not just for legal standing, but for emotional punch. Paragraph 12 stood out. The defendant's unscripted broadcast was not merely an expression of political opinion. It was a targeted narrative designed to collapse the public's trust in the plaintiff's moral legitimacy. It was clear this was more than litigation. It was narrative war, drafted in legalese. Reporters descended on Capitol Hill. Microphones chased AOC through corridors. "Congresswoman, your response to the $90 million lawsuit?" Someone shouted. She kept walking. "Is this a political move to silence dissent?" Another asked. No answer, not yet. But silence was its own response. And that, Vance's team predicted, would drive the story even harder. Meanwhile, legal analysts fumbled for footing. Some claimed it was a stretch. Defamation suits between politicians rarely stuck. Others noted the size of the claim. 90 million? It wasn't about the money. It was about the message. This was scorched earth lawfare, dressed in courtroom formalities. In a quiet corner of a D.C. newsroom, a senior editor at The Atlantic muttered, "This isn't about winning in court. It's about winning in culture." He wasn't wrong. By late afternoon, the coverage had begun to evolve. No longer just, J.D. Vance sues AOC. It was now, will this redefine political speech? Podcasts were already booking constitutional law experts. Opinion columns began appearing. Free speech or fragile egos? When dissent becomes defamation. Vance had anticipated this. He knew the very act of filing would turn the national conversation, not necessarily in his favor, but in his frame. It would raise questions about tone, about consequences, about whether the moral high ground had any standing left. And most importantly, it would force AOC into unfamiliar terrain, defense. But perhaps most telling was what he didn't do. He didn't appear on Hannity. He didn't tweet a clip of the filing. He didn't even offer a quote to Axios. He let the document speak. And in a world drowning in noise, silence became the loudest sound of all. Still, underneath the calculated control, pressure was building. AOC's base was mobilizing. Fundraisers were already popping up. Help AOC fight JD's billionaire backers. Her staff worked through the night, war room style. They knew this wasn't just a legal battle, it was an optics war. And right now, the story wasn't playing by their rules. The next day, a short but chilling statement from her office appeared online. "We will respond soon." and not just in court. Vance saw it the moment it dropped. He smiled, leaned back in his chair, and said to no one in particular, "Good, let her talk." Because every word from now on would be weighed, dissected, archived, and possibly Exhibit A. By dawn, the nation wasn't waking up. It was already mid-scream. Twitter had turned into a digital battlefield, where truth was a weapon and hashtags were ammunition. On one side, conservatives rallied behind hashtag Vance the victim, painting him as a principled man defending honor against reckless progressivism. On the other, liberals shot back with hashtag AOC Unchained, celebrating her refusal to be silenced by legal theatrics. Both hashtags surged into trending within hours, feeding a cultural storm neither side could fully control. Screens lit up across the country. Clips of AOC's original live stream were now stitched into TikToks, Instagram Reels, political ads, even a spoken word poem that had gone viral on YouTube overnight. Commentary poured in from every corner. Radio hosts, academics, pastors, comedians. Everyone had an angle. No one had neutrality. America wasn't watching a lawsuit. It was watching itself, split down the middle, mirrored in outrage. And then AOC stepped in front of a camera again, but this time, not alone in the dark. She appeared in a one-on-one CNN interview, shot live with no script, no teleprompter, just her voice and a glint of something deeper than anger. Resolve. Dressed in calm blues, hair tied back, posture relaxed but grounded, she looked directly into the lens and spoke with surgical clarity. "He's not suing me because I lied," she said softly. "He's suing me because I dared to speak without fear. This isn't about facts. It's about power. It's about whether truth is still allowed when it offends the powerful." The interviewer leaned in. "Congresswoman, do you regret your words?" She didn't blink. "No, I regret staying quiet for as long as I did." It was a moment of controlled fire. No shouting, no theatrics, just an iron spine wrapped in velvet. The segment aired at 7:34 p.m. By 7:39, hashtag AOCUnchained had doubled in use. By 7:45, donation sites supporting her legal defense had already raised over $1.3 million. Vance watched it unfold in real time from his private media war room in Ohio. The team around him sat tense, flipping through analytics, trying to forecast impact. But Vance said nothing. He stared at the screen, still and unreadable. Finally, the CNN segment cut to a commercial. A camera crew from a documentary team, granted rare access, stood nearby, filming behind the scenes. Vance leaned slightly toward them, eyes still on the darkened screen, and spoke just loud enough for the microphone to catch it, though the words were never meant for broadcast. "I don't want her silence," he said flatly. "I want the truth." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a strategy. It was a confession, quiet and deliberate, like a man less interested in winning and more obsessed with being understood. But the line would take on a life of its own. Leaked the next morning, it would be turned into merch, memes, and battleground slogans. Some took it as noble, others as chilling. Still, one thing was now certain. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a test of the limits of voice, of power, of what could be said in the open and what still had to be whispered. And for every word spoken aloud, 10 more brewed in silence, waiting for the next strike. Because no one knew what was in the folder marked Project Shadow Tape. Yet, it was supposed to be a routine oversight session, infrastructure amendments, highway budgets, the kind of dry procedure that normally lulls the press into early lunch. But on that particular morning, no one cared about bridges or bylaws. All eyes were on two seats, one in the front left row held by Senator J.D. Vance, and the other directly across the aisle, occupied by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. C-SPAN viewership surged by 800% within the first 10 minutes. As the session opened, murmurs passed like wind across the chamber. Even seasoned staffers seemed restless, phones half tucked under papers, quietly refreshing Twitter. Something was coming. The air held it. Then it happened. At exactly 10:17 a.m., AOC rose from her seat, calm, precise, as if she had rehearsed the steps in her mind 100 times. She clutched a single, stapled document, white, unassuming, except for the header in bold. United States District Court. A low wave of murmurs swelled instantly. She crossed the aisle without looking at the cameras. Without even looking at Vance, the chamber held its breath. Even the gavel didn't drop. She reached his desk, placed the lawsuit gently in front of him, and said clearly, for every microphone to catch, "Since you're so determined to make history, let's do it on the record." Vance didn't flinch, didn't even glance at the paper. Instead, he looked straight at her and replied, steady as stone, "Good. Let's make it public." Gasps. Actual gasps. The kind of moment that made interns forget protocol and reporters start typing before they could think. Within 30 seconds, a dozen phones went up in the chamber gallery. Camera crews outside the doors surged in like blood through a reopened wound. The procedural session was effectively over. No one would remember the roads bill, or the housing amendment, or anything else on that docket. The two of them stood in the center of the room like opposing forces in a history book no one expected to be writing in real time. But what no one saw, except for a few observant aides, was Vance's left hand. It hovered near his chest for a second longer than usual, touching the inside pocket of his coat where Project Shadow tape still lay, unseen. Not unread, though. Not forgotten. AOC, meanwhile, returned to her seat with the calm of a chess player who'd sacrificed a queen to expose the opponent's king. She didn't smile, didn't grandstand. She simply waited. Media outlets exploded within minutes. AOC delivers court papers live, and Vance takes the bait. Congress goes cinematic. Lawsuit drama erupts on the floor. Policy dead, politics alive. AOC versus Vance now a full-scale spectacle. And while the headlines soared, the divide widened. Supporters of both sides took screenshots of the exchange like sacred relics. TikTokers edited dramatic music under the confrontation. Talk radio compared it to Watergate and Hamilton in the same breath. The lawsuit was no longer a legal document, it was theater. And the nation, exhausted yet mesmerized, didn't blink. By the time the session adjourned, the hallways were filled not with lawmakers, but with flashing lenses and whispered leaks. Staffers spoke of internal emails, strategic war rooms, and, most chilling of all, a new rumor that Vance's team had secured federal clearance for a sealed exhibit in the case. Some claimed it was a psychological operation. Others said it was something more dangerous. But for now, only one thing mattered. They weren't whispering anymore. And neither were J.D. Vance or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. From here on out, everything would be said with cameras rolling and America watching, frame by frame, heartbeat by heartbeat. Because the battle had crossed out of the courtroom and straight into the bloodstream of a nation unsure what it believed anymore, but too addicted to look away. The floor confrontation hadn't just ended a congressional session, it had detonated a political bomb. By the following morning, the fallout began landing in every direction. Inside the Democratic caucus, a rare thing occurred. Unanimity. From progressives to centrists, from rising stars to cautious incumbents, the party circled around AOC like she was the eye of a growing storm. Not because they all agreed with her approach, but because they understood something fundamental. In a media war, hesitation meant extinction. And right now, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was the most compelling headline in the country. Statements poured in. She spoke truth to power. He's trying to sue away dissent. This is a test of democracy, not defamation. Even older moderates who had once whispered concerns about her ambition now posted praise on official accounts. If this was a war of momentum, AOC had it. She was the story, and her party wanted to ride the current. But on the other side of the aisle, the fracture widened. J.D. Vance's lawsuit, intended to project control and retaliation, was being quietly questioned within his own ranks. Not publicly, not yet, but in the closed-door chambers and donor briefings, the word embarrassment had begun to circulate like a slow virus. Some GOP strategists saw it as a tactical misstep. "You're not supposed to swing down," one aide whispered to Politico. "You're supposed to rise above." He made it personal, and that's dangerous. Fox News ran with a split-screen narrative. One commentator cheered Vance as a warrior for male dignity, calling AOC's viral video emotional terrorism. But others on the same network expressed concern that the lawsuit made him look thin-skinned, even rattled. One panelist asked bluntly, "Where does this end? Do we sue every insult now?" Vance didn't flinch. Even as AOC's team began leaking fragments of his old college blog posts, writings filled with overly earnest monologues on masculinity, awkward fiction about restoring the honor of Rome, and one questionable comparison between Lincoln's silence and the loneliness of modern conservatism. He didn't lash out. He read them quietly, then closed the file. Reporters called it an escalation. Analysts called it dirty. But AOC's communications director called it context. Meanwhile, Vance sat with his legal team, flipping through clippings. No statements, no outrage, no press conference. When an aide finally asked if he wanted to respond, Vance gave only one line. "If they aim low, I aim steady." It wasn't bravado, it was geometry. While the public expected rage, he was working something colder, quieter, more methodical. His team had just finalized discovery requests for the lawsuit, and hidden within them were subpoenas, not just for emails, but for every social media draft AOC had written and deleted in the past 18 months. The battle was moving beneath the headlines, past the memes, past the hashtags, into territory where few voters looked: court calendars, federal filings, metadata. And AOC knew it. Because just as her team enjoyed the temporary high of leaked college cringe and cable support, her chief of staff received an encrypted tip from a Capitol Hill journalist. Vance's legal team had submitted a classified exhibit. No one knew what it was, but the judge had already approved it for review. So while the public laughed and the media dissected satire from scandal, those closest to the fire began to feel something else creeping in. Not comedy, not fury, but tension. The sense that behind all the noise, someone was preparing something that didn't need to go viral to go nuclear. And it wouldn't be long before the courtroom would no longer be a metaphor. It would be the stage. It began with a ping, just one, a single notification that no one noticed, except a junior producer at a mid-tier media outlet who had a habit of digging into email metadata on slow news days. The subject line read, "Live stream outline. Strategic cue to push, confidential." What followed was a detailed internal memo, marked as being from a deputy digital director in AOC's staff, mapping out a communications rollout strategy for targeted confrontation. Bullet points laid out pre-approved language, emotional peaks, estimated engagement metrics, and suggested hashtags. And there, near the bottom, in plain language, if the senator takes the bait, we pivot to frame her reaction as retaliatory and position Representative Ocasio-Cortez as truth-teller under siege. Suggested phrase, "They're suing the people's voice." The memo was real. The date on the file was 2 days before the Instagram live stream that lit the match. Within hours, it leaked across all major outlets. Conservative sites splashed it with bold red banners. Staged. Centrist outlets were more careful. Was the live stream a setup? Even some left-leaning commentators admitted unease. A calculated moment is still powerful. But is it authentic? The timing couldn't have been worse for AOC. Just as she had ascended into the role of cultural David facing a legal Goliath, the story flipped. The underdog wasn't a spontaneous truth-teller anymore. She was a strategist, a planner. Perhaps to some, a manipulator. Cable networks that once framed her as the voice of the moment began asking colder questions. When does activism become performance? Is emotional resonance ethical when premeditated? Social media turned like a tide that had hit a seawall. Hashtags morphed from hashtag #AOCunchained to hashtag scripted storm. Clips of her impassioned Instagram speech were now paired with side-by-side excerpts from the leaked outline. Her pauses, her language, even her trembling voice, it had all been anticipated. Behind the scenes, AOC's team scrambled. They issued a carefully worded statement that neither confirmed nor denied the memo's authenticity. Like any public servant, the Congresswoman's digital team prepares for media engagement to ensure clarity of message in connection to the public. But the heart of her message remains her own. It didn't land. Some supporters held fast. Even if it was scripted, the truth still stands. But others felt something they hadn't expected to feel about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez: doubt. In Ohio, J.D. Vance watched it unfold with the quiet of someone who had been waiting for the break in the storm. He didn't gloat. He didn't post. He didn't run to the cameras. Instead, in the stillness of his private office, he turned to his most trusted aide, a man who'd been with him since his first campaign. No media consultant, no strategist, just someone who knew the rhythm of Vance's silences. And Vance whispered only 5 words. "Now they'll listen to me." It wasn't triumph, it was timing. The courtroom no longer looked like a PR disaster. It looked like a reckoning. For months, people had asked whether this lawsuit was about ego. Now, for the first time, some began to wonder, what if he actually had a case? The narrative was no longer AOC's alone, and in the quiet corridors of Capitol Hill, a chill ran down spines on both sides. Not because anyone knew what would come next, but because, for the first time, no one could predict it. The air in the federal courtroom was unnaturally still, thick with the kind of silence that doesn't come from absence, but from anticipation. No one shifted in their seat. No one whispered. Phones were off, eyes forward. Even the reporters, usually huddled and typing madly, sat motionless, like witnesses to a fault line before the quake. Seats in the public gallery had been claimed before sunrise. Congressional interns, law professors, local activists, former campaign staffers, and a smattering of journalists all crammed in, shoulder to shoulder, leaning just slightly forward, as if that might make the truth arrive sooner. The clerk called the session to order. The judge, a woman in her late 60s with a steely gaze and a voice like crushed gravel, entered without ceremony. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The moment was bigger than any opening ritual. Everyone knew what this was. Not just a defamation trial, not just a political feud. This was a referendum on speech itself. And the first to testify was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She stood with quiet composure as she approached the stand. Her green blazer was sharper than usual, her hair pulled back, exposing every angle of her face. There was no crowd to perform for now, no hearts to win, just the record, the law, and the stare of J.D. Vance, silent, unblinking, carved from marble. "Please state your name for the record," the attorney asked. "Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez." Her voice was steady but not cold. Every word she spoke after that was calibrated, weighed, placed with care. She denied intentional malice. She described the live stream as emotional, yes, but genuine. She defended her right to criticize elected officials and their values. "When I called Senator Vance a polished puppet," she said slowly, "I was speaking to a pattern of conduct, detachment from consequences, and alignment with corporate interests over people. But what no one missed, what no camera could fully capture but every person felt, was that something in her had shifted. It was in the eyes. Not fear, not regret. Doubt. The leaked memo from her staff hung over the courtroom like invisible smoke. It hadn't been entered into evidence yet, but its implications colored every word she spoke. The strategy, the timing, the lines that had echoed so powerfully online. Now those very lines echoed in a different room, and this room had no like button. Across from her, J.D. Vance sat expressionless, not smug, not angry, just still, as if his performance began only when hers ended. He didn't glance at the jury. He didn't react to her testimony. His focus remained laser straight, as though he were watching her from a distance, studying not what she said, but why she chose each word. There was something unnerving in his stillness. It wasn't calculated. It was controlled. The cross-examination was sharp but respectful. AOC remained composed, even as the questions narrowed like a vice. "Congresswoman, were you aware that your team circulated messaging guidelines before the livestream? Were phrases like puppet with no soul part of a broader campaign narrative?" She never broke. But again, those eyes. When her testimony concluded, she exhaled once, briefly, as she stepped down. Cameras outside the courthouse caught only a flicker of that breath, but inside it felt like a curtain drawing closed. Then the judge looked toward Vance's table. "Mr. Vance, are you ready to proceed?" He nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. As he rose, the courtroom leaned in again. And for the first time since this began, the crowd wasn't wondering who was louder, sharper, or more viral. They were wondering who, between the two, would still be standing when this was over. The courtroom lights did nothing to soften the hard truth unfolding at the center of the stage. The hush that had settled over the room during Vance's brief acknowledgement now thickened as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez returned. Not to the stand, but to the moment she had long anticipated, her formal public statement. She stood at the front of the courtroom, this time not cross-examined, not flanked by attorneys, but alone. Every inch of her posture was deliberate. Back straight, chin high, voice neither raised nor dulled, but resonant. I don't regret calling out injustice, she began, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. I regret, she continued after a pause, that truth now comes with a price tag. The sentence echoed off marble and wood like the final line of a monologue rehearsed in silence too many nights to count. And yet nothing about her tone felt rehearsed. It felt lived, strained, earned. She spoke of the pain that led to her outburst, not just political frustration, but the years of watching voices like hers be labeled aggressive, reckless, naive. She explained how anger wasn't a tactic, but a symptom of generational fatigue, of cultural erasure, of being told, be grateful you're here, while being dragged for every word once she arrived. But the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably the moment J.D. Vance's attorney stood. Calm, confident, a man with papers that didn't shake in his hands. Congresswoman, he said gently, would you agree that the truth should be consistent, whether spoken on a live stream or written behind closed doors? She nodded, cautious. Then could you help the court understand why this memo from your senior comms director, sent 2 days prior to the broadcast, lists several phrases you used almost verbatim? He handed the printed memo to the judge and jury. The screen to the right of the courtroom flickered on. The lines were there. Let's show him for what he is, a puppet with no soul. Target his silence as complicity. Use a silence as betrayal. Don't engage in legal terms. Make it personal. Gasps scattered through the gallery like glass breaking. The lawyer didn't smirk. He simply continued. Were you aware this memo was distributed to your digital strategy team the same morning as the live stream? AOC's throat visibly tightened. She blinked hard. I reviewed it briefly. I didn't realize how directly some of that language had carried into the stream. But it did carry, yes? Yes, she whispered. Silence. Congresswoman, the lawyer pressed gently, do you believe it is still fair to say that what you spoke was spontaneous truth rather than a crafted attack? She paused. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Then slowly she uncoupled them. I believe in what I said. I believe in why I said it. But maybe I let passion borrow the words of strategy. That's my fault. A single tear traced its way down her cheek. She didn't wipe it immediately. She let it be seen. Let it exist in the space where people often pretend pain is weakness. Behind her, no one dared speak. On Vance's side of the courtroom, there were no cheers. On hers, no defense. Just a heavy stillness. And in the middle of that silence, the American public, watching live across the nation, felt something shift. This wasn't just about whether someone lied. This was about what truth costs when it's packaged for battle. And suddenly, it wasn't clear who was winning, or if anyone ever could. The courtroom still echoed with the vulnerability AOC had just laid bare. Her single tear had left a deeper impression than 1,000 arguments. And yet, when J.D. Vance rose, no one shifted in their seats. The room had become reverent, expectant, not for spectacle, but something heavier. He stepped forward slowly, no paper in hand, no laptop, no exhibit to present, just his voice. This case, he began, not looking at the jury yet, isn't about me. A hush fell deeper. It's about whether we allow character murder to become a form of political currency. He looked straight ahead, not at AOC, not at the cameras, but into the center of the room, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. I've been called many things, he continued, some earned, some exaggerated, and some invented. That's politics. You expect disagreement, but you don't expect people to plan your erasure. You don't expect them to script your downfall like a TV episode. He exhaled sharply. And yet, here we are. A juror shifted subtly. A bailiff glanced toward the press gallery. No one moved to type. Not yet. It was as if even their fingers didn't dare interrupt what had become, inexplicably, intimate. I'm not here because I couldn't take a hit, he said, this time turning to the jury. I'm here because the next person might be 27, fresh out of law school, not wealthy, not white, not male. And what happens when someone scripts their takedown? When the mic's turned off and no one's there to hear them fall? He paused. We call this a lawsuit. I call it a warning. A few seats behind him, a journalist scribbled something down. He didn't speak to win. He spoke like a father warning his kids. Vance glanced at AOC, then quickly away. Not with spite, but with fatigue. I don't hate the Congresswoman, he said. I admire her fire. I believe she believes in what she does. But belief without boundary becomes a weapon. And when that weapon is aimed not at what someone does, but at who they are, we all lose something. He let that sit. Let the weight of it thicken the room. I've made mistakes, he admitted. I've been petty, defensive. I've fought dirty in moments I regret. But even in my lowest, I didn't build a strategy around destruction. I didn't invite millions of strangers to cheer as someone's name got dragged through mud. That isn't politics, that's theater. Finally, his voice dropped, almost too low. If truth must be strategic, and shame can be marketed, and sincerity edited into a meme, what's left? He looked at the judge, then nodded slightly as if to say, that's all I have. The room remained silent. No applause, no gasps, just stillness. The kind that only happens when something raw has been heard instead of argued. And though no verdict had been issued, everyone in that courtroom knew something irreversible had just occurred. The trial had begun as a spectacle, but now it had become a mirror. The silence that followed J.D. Vance's statement didn't last long, not in America's bloodstream of opinion, where everything becomes content and every emotion has an echo. Within 24 hours, social media boiled with fresh takes, legal analysts debated the arc of truth, and television panels rehashed every facial twitch from the trial. But far from the pundits and courtroom flashbulbs in a patch of farmland outside Chillicothe, Ohio, a handwritten letter began circulating among grain silos in tractor repair shops. It wasn't viral, it wasn't performative, but it was real. It began, "To whom it may concern in the cities that never notice us." 12 paragraphs later, it carried a message not of partisanship, but of presence. JD may not be flashy. He doesn't give sound bites or post fiery threads, but he shows up. He sat with us when the floods came. He showed up when the plant shut down. He came with nothing to sell and no camera crew. Just listened. Sometimes that's more than a speech. Signed, "The folks you forget exist." Local papers picked it up first. Then a few journalists tweeted it out with mild interest. But in a country starved for sincerity, the letter hit a nerve. Suddenly, the idea of a man not performing, but enduring, resonated. It wasn't a roar. It was a hum. In contrast, Brooklyn echoed with another voice. A young Latina named Maritza Flores, 21, posted a video, not professionally lit, not filtered, just her, seated on a fire escape, Manhattan's skyline glowing behind her like a fading memory. "I've never met AOC," she said, eyes bright but tired, "but I've been in the rooms she fights to protect. Rent courtrooms, food pantries, school halls where the ceiling leaks every time it rains." She held up a folded piece of notebook paper. "This is my letter," she said. "It doesn't have stamps or headlines, but if y'all are reading open letters now, here's mine." She read it aloud, voice steady. "She's our voice. When she's loud, we get heard. When she's angry, we finally feel safe enough to be angry too. If she fall, we all do. Don't confuse strategy for survival. This system teaches us to scream before we're erased." The clip was shared 1,000 times an hour, not because it was polished, but because it was raw. AOC retweeted it without comment, just 3 words. "I hear you." In Washington, the courtroom turned pages of motions and filings. Lawyers prepared cross-examinations, and camera lenses waited to capture the next outburst. But outside, in the quiet corners of the country, barbershops, cafeterias, commuter trains, a different dialogue bloomed. It was less about who would win and more about what was being revealed. That's what happens when truth leaves the chamber. It ripples outward. It becomes owned not by the powerful, but by the watchers. Those who carry burdens far from the courtroom, but recognize themselves in the cracks. As J.D. Vance returned home that evening, his team handed him a copy of the Ohio letter. He read it in the back of the car, then placed it quietly in his coat pocket, next to an unopened legal brief. Meanwhile, across the city, AOC sat with Maritz's video, replaying silently on her phone, the soft hum of Brooklyn noise behind her. Neither spoke, but across the country the people had, and the story was no longer just theirs. By midweek, the trial was no longer confined to the federal courthouse. It had become a prism, bending light in every direction, reflecting different truths depending on where you stood. The media, once confidently lined up along party seams, now began to show hairline fractures, and in those fractures, a strange uncertainty grew. The New York Times ran a Sunday feature titled "When Words Wound." It didn't take sides. It didn't declare winners. But it posed a question that made its way into breakfast tables and boardrooms alike. What if both were telling the truth? What if truth itself had become positional, molded by where you sit, who you trust, and what you fear? The article cited legal scholars and moral philosophers, tracing the fine line between calling out injustice and weaponizing speech. It quoted a First Amendment professor who admitted, almost reluctantly, "We're entering an age where truth has PR teams. That's dangerous." J.D. Vance's legal team clipped the quote and included it in a press email within the hour. On the other side of the spectrum, something equally curious unfolded. Fox News, which had initially mocked the lawsuit as a desperate grab for relevance, pivoted its tone. Not all at once, but subtly in tone and framing. One anchor opened with, "Even Vance's critics admit the lawsuit exposed a pattern, a media ecosystem where outrage is engineered, not discovered." Suddenly, words like manipulation, manufactured consent, and algorithmic distortion entered the conversation, not in defense of J.D. Vance as a politician, but in defense of the idea that something bigger was broken. The shift wasn't universal. Some anchors doubled down on character attacks, but the monolith had cracked. And in that fracture, the public leaned in. A viral poll released by Quinn/Grant shocked pundits on both sides. Question: who do you believe is telling the truth? AOC or J.D. Vance? Results: AOC 32%, J.D. Vance 17%, unsure 51%. That last number landed like a thunderclap, not because it indicated apathy, but because it revealed that something had shifted. For once, Americans weren't picking teams. They were pausing. Cable networks scrambled. The assumption that audiences wanted certainty was now in question. Editors assigned long-form explainer pieces. Podcasts flooded with think pieces titled "The Lawsuit That Shook Certainty" and "Speech Power and the Price of Being Right." In private, Vance's communication strategist leaned back in her chair and whispered, "The longer they hesitate, the more control we get." Vance didn't smile. He simply nodded. Meanwhile, AOC's inner circle ran damage control with brutal precision. They issued a string of clarifying statements, released a behind-the-scenes clip from the live stream's planning session to prove transparency, and launched a community tour under the banner, "Keep it honest." But even her most devoted followers sensed the terrain had shifted. The narrative was no longer David versus Goliath. It was something messier. Two giants clashing over the right to shape reality. In classrooms and kitchens, in union halls and comment threads, a new conversation stirred. Can we still tell who's fighting for us and who's performing for the camera? No one had the answer, but everyone was watching. And the trial, once thought to be a minor footnote in the endless political cycle, had become something far more dangerous. A mirror. The clip was only 4 seconds long, but it detonated like a slow bomb across the country. The setting was a break during court recess. AOC, surrounded by her staff in a tight hallway, leaned in and whispered sharply, perhaps thinking the microphones were cut, except they weren't. "This isn't what I planned," she snapped, brushing past a visibly rattled aide, frustration thick in her voice. Within minutes, it was clipped, subtitled, and trending. Hashtag not what I planned shot to the top of Twitter. Her critics claimed it was the mass slipping, proof of orchestration, performance, control. Her supporters scrambled to contextualize. She's exhausted. She's under fire. Who wouldn't crack under this pressure? But the damage had already settled in the public bloodstream, not as scandal, but as something quieter and more corrosive: doubt. The courtroom footage, once covered breathlessly, began to blur in meaning. News anchors now sounded cautious, even uncertain. The trial wasn't unfolding with the moral clarity some had hoped for. Instead, it had become a national Rorschach test. And Americans, staring at the ink blot, saw what they were afraid of: betrayal, ego, manipulation, fatigue, or maybe just two people trapped in a machine bigger than them both. J.D. Vance, true to form, said nothing publicly. But in the dim warmth of a podcast studio in Cincinnati, he sat down behind a worn mic and pressed record. No sponsors, no music, just his voice. The episode title read, "The Cost of Restraint." "I've been told to play the victim. I won't," he began, his tone stripped of performance. "I've also been told to win this moment. I'm not interested in that either. The truth is, what we're watching isn't a fight between good and evil. It's a symptom of something deeper. How disagreement in this country stopped being about ideas and started becoming about annihilation." He paused long enough for the silence to feel deliberate. "I didn't sue to win an argument. I sued because we've forgotten how to lose with dignity and disagree without destruction." The episode was downloaded nearly 1 million times within 48 hours. For the first time since the live stream that launched this war, the public tone softened. Columnists began to question the architecture of the entire media political spectacle. University town halls hosted debates not about who was right, but about how both had gone wrong. One student in Michigan asked aloud, "If disagreement always turns into lawsuits and live streams, what happens to democracy?" That question echoed far beyond the lecture halls. And so the story stopped being about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and J.D. Vance. It became about us, about how easily we vilify instead of listen, about the way microphones amplify anger faster than nuance, about the toll of turning every disagreement into theater and every opponent into a villain. By week's end, both camps had lost momentum, but something unexpected had risen in its place: a collective pause. Not surrender, not peace, but maybe, just maybe, a moment of clarity. The courtroom, which had become a stage for weeks of national tension, was quieter than it had ever been. Reporters sat frozen with pens poised, unsure whether this moment would erupt into cheers, outrage, or simply silence. Families across the country had tuned in not for legal analysis, but because somehow the outcome felt personal. Judge Harlan sat at the bench, expression unreadable. A former public defender turned federal judge, he had presided over thousands of cases, but none like this. None that had ignited this kind of cultural fire. None that had carried not only legal consequences, but moral symbolism. He cleared his throat. "This court has reviewed the full record, including the live stream material, the internal communications from both parties, and the testimony offered under oath. The matter before us is not merely a legal one, but a cultural one." A ripple of anticipation passed through the gallery. Even the clicking of press cameras seemed to hesitate. While this court finds no evidence of criminal malice, it does find a pattern of intentional mischaracterization that qualifies as defamation under federal statute. The damage done was not to reputation alone, but to the basic expectation of truth in public discourse. There was no gasp, no cries of victory, only the soft shifting of bodies leaning forward, absorbing the words like a wave pulling back from shore. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Senator J.D. Vance. AOC closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't blink rapidly in disbelief. She just nodded. Once, But what came next startled even the judge. Vance stood. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, voice clear and calm, "I would like to amend my claim for damages." A hush fell. "I no longer seek financial compensation, not the original $90 million, not even a penny for punitive impact. I request $1. 1A murmur of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Explain your reasoning." Vance took a breath. "Because this was never about money. It was never about silencing anyone. It was about marking a line, a boundary in public life. We can debate, we can argue passionately, but we cannot assassinate character and call it strategy. I ask for $1 to affirm that line." The judge leaned back slightly, studying him. Then slowly he nodded. "Granted," Judge Harlan said, "the court awards the plaintiff $1 in damages. This is about integrity, not injury." The gavel struck once, not loudly, but it echoed like thunder. The nation absorbed the outcome in waves. Cable news anchors scrambled for commentary. Pundits debated whether Vance's gesture was noble or performative. Social media fractured again, some calling it a masterclass in restraint, others claiming he won the war but lost the people. But beneath the noise, something else began to settle. A stillness. People were tired of spectacle, of spin, of choosing sides not because they believed, but because they were told to. And somehow a dollar had become the symbol of something more profound than money ever could. Outside the courthouse, Vance stood in front of the microphones but did not speak immediately. Cameras rolled, flashes went off. He looked around, at protesters, supporters, journalists, tourists, and then simply said, "This isn't a victory, it's a verdict. What we do with it, that's up to all of us." Then he walked away. No parade, no fists raised. Just a man who drew a line and didn't step over it, even when he had the chance. Inside, AOC quietly exited through a side door, flanked by 2 aides. Her head was high, but her steps slower than before. In her silence, there was no shame, only reflection, and for once the country didn't rush to judge either of them. They watched, they wondered, and in the quiet aftermath of Decision Day, America stood at its own crossroad, not with anger, but with the rarest political feeling of all, possibility. The House chamber was unusually full for a midweek afternoon. The air buzzed with a strange, restrained electricity. Not one of debate or legislation, but of anticipation. Members of Congress, aides, journalists, and even janitors crowded the upper gallery. No one wanted to miss this moment. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood behind the podium, not as a firebrand today, not even as a leader, but simply as someone who had made a mistake and was ready to face it. The script of her apology lay in front of her, printed in plain font on a white sheet of paper. Her fingers didn't tremble, but her eyes paused on the first line longer than necessary. When she began, her voice was steady. No quiver, no deflection. "Mr. Speaker and members of this body," she began, "I rise today not to defend myself, but to acknowledge the weight of my own words." Every head in the chamber turned toward her. Cameras clicked softly in the background. No one interrupted. "I regret the manner in which my public comments regarding Senator Vance were delivered. They were accusatory, emotionally driven, and did not reflect the level of care that the office I hold demands. I understand that, and I take responsibility for it." She looked up. A few Democrats lowered their gaze. Across the aisle, some Republicans seemed genuinely surprised, not at her presence, but at the tone. "My words were fiery," she continued, voice firmer now, "because I care. I care deeply about truth, about justice, about the people we are supposed to serve. But care must be careful, and I wasn't." Silence followed, not the awkward kind, but the kind that hangs in the air when something real has just been said. I allowed emotion to outpace evidence, and in doing so, I gave the public a performance when they deserved clarity. I won't pretend it didn't matter. It mattered too much. She folded the paper slowly and stepped away from the microphone. But then, unprompted, she turned back, eyes scanning the room. Not seeking approval, just presence. "I'm not here to reclaim reputation," she said, her voice softer. "I'm here to rebuild trust. And that doesn't happen in one speech. It happens in every sentence that follows. A few colleagues nodded subtly. Others didn't move at all. One Republican congressman muttered something under his breath, but even he didn't walk out. Outside the chamber, reporters buzzed, debating whether the apology was politically calculated or personally sincere. Inside, the moment wasn't about spin, it was about what comes after humiliation, after exposure, after the storm. It was about choosing to speak, not to retaliate, but to repair. As AOC stepped away from the podium, she didn't smile. She didn't perform. She simply walked back to her seat, placed the folded apology in her purse, and sat in silence. She knew not everyone would accept her words. Some never would. But the apology wasn't for headlines or forgiveness. It was for history, and for the next conversation that might finally be different. The chamber slowly emptied, but the tension still lingered like fog after rain. The air was clearer, yes, but heavy with what had just been said. Most walked away with mixed emotions: admiration, suspicion, maybe even reluctant respect. But two people didn't leave with the crowd. Behind the velvet partition backstage, out of the camera's reach and beneath the dull hum of old fluorescent lights, J.D. Vance waited near the far wall, arms crossed, expression unreadable. AOC emerged from the side hallway, blazer folded over one arm, her hair pulled back tightly now, not for show but for clarity. She paused when she saw him, as if wondering whether to speak first. He didn't give her the burden. "Quite a moment," he said quietly, with the tone of someone acknowledging weight without decoration. She nodded once. It was overdue. There was no bitterness between them, not here. The anger had been spent in microphones and courtrooms. What remained was something far rarer in Washington: mutual recognition of damage done, and a quiet attempt not to deepen it. Vance stepped forward and offered his hand. AOC hesitated just briefly, then took it. He leaned in, voice low. "Let's argue better next time." A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Not a grin, not approval, just something real. "Just don't expect me to go easy," she replied. Their handshake lasted a second longer than necessary, not out of performance, but because neither had anything left to prove. The lawsuit, the media storm, the moment of courtroom clarity, it had all built to this. Two ideological opposites finding, if not common ground, then at least a shared sense of responsibility. As she turned to go, Vance called after her. "You were right about one thing." She turned curious. "When truth comes with a price tag, it's not justice, it's theater." She tilted her head. "Then maybe it's time we stop selling tickets." And with that, she disappeared down the hallway. For once, there were no microphones, no spin rooms, no tweets waiting in drafts. Just two lawmakers walking away from the fire they helped start, aware that they couldn't undo the damage, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something better from the ashes. It wasn't peace, but it was something else, a different kind of victory. The banners at Columbia's low library steps fluttered beneath an early spring breeze. Bipartisan Youth Summit, rebuilding trust in democracy. It was the kind of event where handshakes came with disclaimers and optimism wore a cautious smile. Inside the hall, students filled every seat, some sitting on the floor, backpacks crumpled beneath them, phones raised. They had come not just for politics, but to witness a moment. On stage, two figures took their seats, not behind opposing podiums, but side by side. J.D. Vance in a dark gray suit with sleeves slightly wrinkled from travel. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in a navy blue blazer, minimal makeup, glasses on. The audience wasn't silent, just reverent. The moderator cleared his throat. "We never thought we'd see the two of you sharing a platform again. But maybe that's the point." Laughter broke the tension. Then came the question that silenced the room. A sophomore stood up. His voice was young, but his tone was worn with sincerity. "What did you learn from all this?" he asked. "Really learn? Not as politicians, but as people?" There was a pause. J.D. Vance leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes scanning the students in front of him. "I learned," he began slowly, "that winning costs more than it gives, unless it changes something, unless it wakes people up, unless it pushes us to rebuild." He paused. If a lawsuit just makes headlines, it's vanity. If it makes a nation ask better questions, maybe it was worth it. A few scattered claps, then a stronger round followed. Vance didn't smile. He wasn't here for applause. AOC glanced sideways at him, then faced the crowd. "We both carry scars from it," she said. "Not all of them are visible, and not all of them were fair. But if we don't listen, even when it hurts, we're just actors reading scripts written by fear." A camera flash lit the moment. It felt for once unscripted. Outside, clouds moved in. Inside, something settled. This wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. Vance looked at the student again. "What I learned," he repeated, "is that you can win and still lose, unless you leave something behind that makes things better." The student sat down slowly. He didn't reach for his phone. He just watched the stage, as if history, even in its quietest form, was happening right in front of him. The auditorium buzzed with soft murmurs as the session continued. The next panel was scheduled to begin, but no one moved, not even the moderators. What had just unfolded felt unfinished, suspended in something bigger than programming. And so AOC leaned toward the microphone once more. "I learned," she said clearly, "that truth is powerful, but also fragile in the wrong hands, even mine." A quiet ripple of surprise moved across the crowd, not because of what she said, but because of who had said it. "Everyone thinks they're on the right side," she continued, "but good intentions don't protect us from causing harm. Only humility does." She looked over at J.D. Vance. "That's something I didn't have enough of, not when it mattered most." The moderator blinked. "Would you say you regret it?" "I regret parts of it," she replied. "Not the cause, but the method. My words were meant to wake people up, but sometimes I think they were shaped more by anger than clarity." A tear slid down a girl's cheek in the third row. J.D. Vance spoke next. "Anger has a place, but it needs a seatbelt. Otherwise, it crashes into things we never meant to break." The students laughed, softly, appreciatively, and then, as if on cue, an aide brought out a single sheet of paper, mounted on a thick wooden board. The moderator turned it toward the audience. "The first draft of the Pledge of Constructive Conflict," he announced. The pledge was simple, 4 short lines. "I will speak with purpose. I will listen with humility. I will confront without cruelty. I will stand for truth, even when I must stand alone." AOC took the pen first. JD followed. They didn't pose. They just signed. The moderator handed it to a group of student leaders. The crowd rose, slowly at first, then all at once. Not with the loud cheers of politics, but with the quiet, resonant respect of people who had witnessed something shift. Not a policy passed, not a debate won. Something human. Backstage, a producer whispered into her headset, stunned. That wasn't part of the schedule. But sometimes the best conversations, the ones that heal, never are. 3 months had passed, but the story hadn't faded. It had simply settled, leaving behind quieter echoes in places that didn't make headlines. In Ohio, J.D. Vance stood before a group of steelworkers beneath the faded canopy of a local union hall. There were no reporters, no flashy graphics, just chalk dust and earnest questions. He spoke plainly, answering concerns about job security, automation, and trade policy. But it wasn't the policy that left an impression. It was how he listened, unhurried, unscripted, present. When a young man admitted he didn't know how to apply for a grant to train as a welder, Vance didn't delegate. He sat down beside him and filled it out together. In the Bronx, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez moved through the narrow corridors of a once-shuttered community kitchen. She stacked canned goods, laughed with the volunteers, and held the hand of an elderly woman who whispered through tears, "They forgot us, but you didn't." The food program, closed due to funding gaps, was now back, rebuilt not just with policy dollars, but with something rarer, political will that stayed after the cameras left. AOC didn't make a speech that day. She just stayed, long enough to matter. There were no grand declarations, no mutual endorsements. They didn't suddenly agree on the world, but they had, in different ways, remembered who the work was for. Somewhere, in a middle school classroom far from New York or Ohio, a civics teacher wrote the quote of the day on the whiteboard. The letters were crooked but clear. Words can tear down nations or build them back up. Choose carefully. The students read it, not knowing where it came from, but it stuck with them. Because even if names fade and moments pass, the example stays. And sometimes legacy isn't about who won, but about what survives after the shouting ends. This story reminds us that strength isn't in always being right. It's in choosing how we respond when challenged. Both JD and AOC made mistakes, but they also chose growth over pride, conversation over combat. In a time of division, their journey shows that disagreement doesn't have to end in destruction. It can end in understanding, if we let it. What about you? Have you ever had a disagreement that taught you something deeper than being right ever could? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.